in order for me to talk about trees and invertebrates from an ecological perspective, you kind of need to understand why the invertebrates go after trees. So I kind of need to explain what trees are, almost. So I need to explain trees, I need to explain invertebrates, trees and vertebrates, but that middle bit, which is fungi, so really this talk, it's a third trees, a third fungi, and a third invertebrates, because they're all just a trifecta. They're all interlinked, like a trinity. So the more knowledgeable about trees will probably hear what I'm going to say and be like, that's way too simplistic. But I try and reduce things down to their most basic level just for illustrative points. So with trees, at their most basic level, they're essentially tubes of water and sticks of sugar. And they use their leaves, their chlorophyll, for photosynthesis. So they're taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they're taking sunlight from the sky, and they're taking water and nutrients from the soil to basically create their own food. They're not autotrophic, because that's when they eat themselves, but basically they generate their own foods, their own sugars through photosynthesis. And basically photosynthesis, it creates the glucose, creates the sugars, and that's the basic form of energy for everything that the tree does, from more photosynthesis, from respiration to growth, to creating the building blocks that becomes the wood. So everything in a tree is basically the product of photosynthesis and all those sort of sugars and carbohydrates. Now, when you have things like fungi and invertebrates, they're more like us in the sense that they can't generate their own food. So at its most basic level, trees generate their own food. Fungi and invertebrates can't generate their own food, so they need that food resource from somewhere, which is where trees and plants come in, because at their most basic level, they're just tower blocks of sugar. And if we look at the oak tree behind us, or behind you, sorry, this is an amazing example because it's almost got kind of every habitat in one. So again, you can see a nice canopy, half a canopy for the leaves. So that's the tree photosynthesizing, nice to fill of sugars, but also half the tree is dying off. And one of the wonderful, amazing things about trees is that theoretically they can be seen as immortal. So one thing that almost everyone knows about trees is that they have growth rings. So they're producing new wood every single year, growing wider and expanding. So they're essentially a continually renewing resource. And if I cut my hand or my arm, the skin cells scab over and then the cells regenerate. But trees don't do that. If cells in a tree die, then they're always dead. They can't come back to life. Those particular cells die. But what it can do, it can grow around the wounds. And so where you have the tree, you have those dead branches, they will always be dead, but the tree can put new growth around it. So if, again, going back to the human analogy, if I have a really bad wound to my arm, I might lose my arm and I'll never get another natural arm back. Whereas the tree can just continue to produce new branches, it can produce new arms and new legs. Whereas I can't have another natural arm. So what that basically means is that dead wood, that dead resource, isn't harmful to the tree. Many years ago, there was this thing called the sugar stick theory, where you had dead wood and it attracted harmful pathogens and invasiveness coming into the tree, so dead wood created more dead wood, which isn't strictly true. And I said about how trees are you can see trees as continual tubes of water. So again, going back to a very reduced down analogy, the water comes in from the roots, goes up the trunk, goes into the branches and goes through the leaves. And where you have continually moving water, that functional wood, the kind of fungi that can contribute to that dead wood, they need carbon dioxide to germinate. But a tree I got that wrong. They need oxygen. They need aerated, oxygenated wood to germinate. But where you have a water-filled tree, the wood decay fungi can't germinate. So in its most basic terms, a healthy tree is full of functional water-filled wood. the way you create wounds, be it from physical tree surgery, from storms, from frost damage, from animals or invertebrates, you create small areas of dysfunction within the tree. And that's when the wood starts to decay, and then invertebrates come in, and then that's where that decay process starts to come through. So in the very olden days, we'd look at trees like that and go, oh, it's a sick tree, it's a dying tree, then they'd sadly be cut down. But now, luckily, we know a lot more. We know so much more about how trees live and how trees grow and how trees can keep on going, in theory, forever. But we'll take a quick look at this oak here, just to make it a bit more interactive. But people heard of lammas growth. So there's an old Celtic or Gaelic or an old English festival time of year called Lammas, which is I think towards the end of July, beginning of August, and it coincides with a new flush, new growth on oak trees. But if everyone actually wants to sort of grab and feel a leaf, just take a leaf off. One thing that's quite cool is actually holding the leaf up to the sun. You can sort of see all the veins and how transparent, translucent it is. So what you're kind of holding in your hand here is basically a solar panel. So this is where the energy is created from photosynthesis. So these are the powerhouses of the trees. So these are full of sugars, and predictably there isn't a lot on these leaves, but tree leaves in themselves are one of the most phenomenal types of habitat, in my opinion, in the world, really, because thousands and thousands of species can be dependent upon leaves. Again, when I said about being tactile, has everyone got their tree leaf? Physically feel one of the darker green leaves, one of the older leaves. They're quite tough, quite leathery. So that's really the first line of the tree's defence, because you have all these insects that want to get in and sort of suck out the sap, like aphids. But the tree doesn't want that. If you want to look at it in economic terms, the tree's laid down an investment of its energy, and it wants a good return on its investment, and it doesn't want its resources being stolen. So one of the first ways it can do that is by creating quite thick, tough, leathery leaves. And that can stop a whole range of insects actually getting into the leaf. But if you see here, there's a whole bunch of holes. So things like caterpillars and leaf mining flies, leaf mining bees, leaf cutters, that's what they're called, leaf cutters. They've got much stronger jaws. They're much bigger than the aphids, and they've got much stronger jaws. So they sort of come in, and then they start munching away on the leaves. Now, in small doses, that's fine. It's not really much of a problem. I mean, think about how many tens of thousands of leaves are on this tree. It doesn't do a great deal of damage. But where you might have heavier infestations, particularly of invasive insects, I'm guessing you're vaguely familiar with the oak processionary moth. So that's an invasive caterpillar. It's not as bad in terms of complete defoliation as it is on turkey oak. Turkey oak, it's its natural food source. But in extreme cases, you can have heavy infestations of caterpillars that can defoliate a tree. The tree's not photosynthesizing, it's not creating energy, it's not growing. So there can be quite bad problems for tree health. Now, I mentioned lammas. So the trees they grow, they put out their first flush of leaves in the spring when it gets warmer, when there's more sunlight. So by sort of June, July, the tree's got a full canopy of leaves. But for something that doesn't have a brain or a central nervous system, trees have a complete inbuilt genius, because they've realised when the heavier caterpillar activity is, and they've sort of worked out that come the end of July, the majority of the caterpillars have pupated and become butterflies and moths. So what it does is it puts out a new flush of growth at the end of July, or we're at the beginning of July, and that's known as lammas growth because it happens around the sort of lammas festival time of year. So quite often you can see oak trees sort of June, August, July time, and they've got lighter green, almost like whips, small branches coming through, a much lighter, you can see there's a lighter shade of green. So one of the genius ways in that trees can cope with that is it produces new growth. So this is what we call lammus growth, which is basically the tree compensating for lost foliage from things like caterpillars and invertebrates, which to me, I just find that so genius, really. And
Is that all species? Is it only oak trees or just...
so this is predominantly oak trees do that.
Yeah.
And some trees like lime, they'll just flush back all the time as long as it's growing, because they're so hyper fast, hyper mobile. But also one cool thing, so this twig, this little shoot, this green bit, so where any green tissues on a tree has chlorophyll, that's why it's green. So everyone sort of thinks of the leaves as where photosynthesis happens, but you can actually have photosynthesis happening in this little twig as well, this little shoot. And some, not oak trees because they've got very thick bark, but on smoother bark trees like London plane, you might see sort of thin green lines. So some trees have an ability to actually photosynthesize through their bark, which is quite, for me, I find that quite cool. Actually come look at the actual trunk itself. Again, just put your hand on the trunk, touch and feel it. One of the great things about oak is it's not a smooth bark tree. It has these really deep, rugged, ridged, furrowed cracks in the bark. And, you know, for someone like me, sort of 6'2", 6'3", it's a bit hard to imagine what it's like to be something that's about 2 or 3 millimeters in size. But where you have these furrows and ridges, right in the depths of the crevices, they're actually surprisingly stable micro-habitats. So there's a whole range of, particularly I think flies, that actually lay their eggs in the crevices of bark. So lime trees, again, are great for this. It's one of the reasons I love lime trees. Crevice, every single dent in itself is its own micro-habitat. And on the northern side, on the southern side, where you have different areas of sun exposure, different levels of rain and moisture, again, you can have completely different types of habitats. An old desiccated fungal bracket of the beefsteak fungus. Beefsteak fungus. So when it's nice and fresh, it's an amazing sort of crimson coloured fungal bracket that looks like steak. It's a very, very short-lived bracket, and it decays off very quickly. And so again, this is for me, it's a really, really wonderful fungus because it's just pure ecological goodness. So it not in this stage, but it can be. When it's nice and fresh, you can cut it off in thin slivers. I have tried it. It wasn't much to write home about, but it won't do you any harm. So again, I talked about how on the one hand you have the tree, then you have the invertebrates, but you need that middle stage of decay. Now, a healthy tree, the theoretically perfect healthy tree, full of water, no dysfunction going on, which is great for the tree, but it's not good for anything else, because you can't have anything living inside the tree. But where you have areas of wounding, so in this case you can see we've got, people on that side might not see, but you've got an old branch that's snapped out. For as amazing and strong as oak trees are, they can break apart surprisingly easily. Actually, they're very prone to lightning strikes because that bark acts like water channels and big lightning conductors. In a lot of the sort of pagan beliefs, like in Norse mythology, Greek mythology and Roman mythology, all like the chief gods like Thor, Zeus, Jupiter, were all associated with thunder and the oak tree, because a tree that was struck by lightning as often as the oak tree was seen as being touched by the gods. Bit of a tangent there, but something I find really fascinating. Okay, so where you have that, so that's wood that's broken apart and it becomes exposed to the air, and the water no longer moves through that part of the tree. So that then becomes dysfunctional wood, and then that becomes dead wood. Then that allows fungi like the beefsteak fungus to come in and to start decaying away at the wood. Now something like this, it's an incredibly slow acting fungus. So when the tree produces new growth rings, it's actually outgrowing the rate of decay. So structurally speaking, this type of the decay from this type of fungus is insignificant to the tree. It's not one really to, from my perspective, I'd note it on the report, but I wouldn't worry about it. And what's happening is that you're creating this amazing slow growing decay. And also the fungus itself has thousands of different species living inside it. So again, it's not just the actual tree and the wood that's the habitat, it's all these fungal fruiting bodies which can have all sorts of flies. I got in trouble at work because I brought in an old decaying dried saddle fungus, left it over the weekend to get a spore print. It just decayed and then the office was full of flies. So I wasn't everyone's favourite person at that stage. The primary purpose of the bark is to act as a protective casing from the outside world. So it will have kind of adapted to have the bark that most suits its environment, to make sense. And the way in which the growing cells in the wood are laid down is you have something called the cambium layer, which is in between the sapwood and the bark, and that's where cell division and wood growth happens. And trees like oak, for whatever reason, have lots of overlapping areas that pushes the bark out rather than a single cylinder, which is kind of why you get the knobbly bark, because it's to do with the way in which the cells are distributed. Over here, because I want to. So on trees like the oak tree, you have two types of wood. You have sapwood and heartwood. So the sapwood is the outer rings of the tree where the sap and the water is moving up and down the tree. And then you have the heartwood, which is the inner part of the tree. Now, so hardwood species like oak, sweet chestnut, yew all produce heartwood. When you have trees like beech or ash or sycamore, it's not. I won't go into that level of detail, but there's different. It's physiologically different. It's referred to as ripe wood or non-durable wood, non-durable heartwood. Anyway, so the tree on the inside is essentially dead. The heartwood is dead, but it's only the very outer cells of the tree that are actually living, actually have water moving through. But what that means is you have two different types of wood that decay at different times, and the sapwood is full of nutrients. So you can see on here they have almost like a spongy outer shell, and just above it we have more brittle, different textures. So that's the sapwood that's decaying, and you can see all these tiny insect holes. So when the invertebrates in their early stage, the invertebrates inside the tree, they're sort of munching away on the dead wood, and then they kind of emerge from the tree, and you have these thousands and thousands of tiny holes. And if you want to come in and look closer, you can see they're all different sizes as well. And sometimes lower down there can be thicker holes, and higher up they're smaller. Again, because there's just different species of invertebrate living through. So on this side, we have some bark left on the trunk. So the bark is the outer protective casing of the tree, and immediately beneath the bark is where you have the cambium cells, and that's where the cell division happens, where the tree grows from. That's where the annual ring grows. So that area of cambium on the tree trunk is where there's the highest level of nutrients, which is where there's the highest level of energy within the tree. When the tree dies or becomes weakened, this is kind of the first point I want to go. And because it's a very, very thin layer, the bark can fall off. So quite often you'll end up with patches of dead bark on the ground, which in itself to me is amazing, because it's creating its own little niche microhabitat on the ground. And quite often if you pick up bark on the ground, you have all manner of things like slugs and millipedes and various other things on there. But if you take it off here, you have completely different invertebrate species. I've even found newts living in trees. Bats are a bit like hamsters in the sense that they can shrink into really tight, small spaces. So where you have loose crevices behind the bark, it's a perfect habitat for their roosting spots. Okay, so again, going back to basic tree biology, wood is made up of two main components, lignin and cellulose. Cellulose is basically carbohydrate. It's kind of what all of our clothing is made out of. It's also, insoluble fibre in food is predominantly cellulose. Cellulose is basically what gives the trees its ability to move and to flex. If you ever see a tree moving in the wind, it's because it's the cellulose that gives the tree its flexibility. Lignin, on the other hand, is kind of like tree cement. It's what keeps trees standing. If you've ever wondered the difference between a sunflower and a tree, sunflowers don't have lignin, so their stems are not very tough, not very strong, which is why they flop over. Whereas trees have a process of lignification, where it goes from cellulose heavy to actual wood. So the difference between trees and non-trees is lignin creating wood. In human terms, lignin's like our bones, and then cellulose is like our muscles. It's that strength and that flexibility. Now, different types of fungi preferentially go after lignin or go after cellulose. And where you have cellulose heavy decay fungi, they leave behind very kind of crumbly, sort of reddy, brownish decayed areas. Whereas where you have ones that go after either everything in the tree or just the lignin, they leave behind very white and spongy decay. Now, those spongy areas on the oak behind us, where we looked at before, that was a white rock because the decay is still very white and spongy. But it's actually this kind of stuff, what we call the brown rock, that's ecologically the most important, because ultimately this in the tree is what goes back into the ground, back into the soil to create that humus layer. And it's also things like beetles, it's prime habitat. One of the amazing things about how trees hollow and decay is it can take so long. The good thing is that you have an 800 to 1,000 year old oak tree. It's creating that habitat that lasts centuries. The disadvantage is it can take several hundred years to get to that habitat as well. You have some really quite rare specialist species that can only live on the fungal parts, so the fungal mycelium inside a tree. So there's, I think the cardinal click beetle only lives on the mycelium, which is the body of the fungus, on a particular type of fungus, which can only grow on oak trees over 300 years old. So that one species of beetle basically has to wait about 300 years for the right habitat to come through. But once it's there, it can keep on going for several hundred years. But one thing that's fascinating about how trees decay is that you have the primary decay, which is where the wood goes from functional to non-functional. Then you have all the different other decay fungi coming in, which is where you have like the beefsteak fungus, and that creates a different habitat where you have things like gnats and hoverflies and beetles coming through. But this is the part I really love, is that after that wood's decayed, you have another type of invertebrate coming through, the really more unusual ones. And these are the ones that kind of live sort of way down there. So where it can take several decades to decay, you have all sorts of unusual things living on sort of decaying matter like that. On the one hand, I don't have a lot of sympathy because they're so picky and so specialist. They're kind of not doing themselves any favours. But keeping stumps, well, keeping dead standing trees is amazing, but actually keeping stumps is one of the best things you can do, because things like the stag beetles, you have the greater and the lesser, one of which is really rare, the other one's a bit more common but still fairly rare. So actually removing stumps like that just causes a population crash, so it's really quite amazing. But we'll go over. This is a hawthorn. My actual favourite tree species is hawthorn. I think they're amazing. And old hawthorns are utterly incredible. And We're actually not going to look at the we're not going to look at the deadwood on this. We're going to look at the emerging berries, the emerging haws, because they used to be flowers. So I've talked about deadwood insects, which are saproxylic insects. So sapro meaning decaying and xylic meaning wood, or detritivores. I think that's a cool word. But also pollinators, different type of. Well, no, actually, they're still the same species, but different life stages. So what I've talked about so far are the baby invertebrates living inside the tree in their larval pupal form. They go around munching away on the dead wood, but they get to a point where they have to emerge and become their adult form. Stag beetles, crane flies, hoverflies, gnats, mites, anything really. But the key difference is that when they metamorphosize and become the flying insects, they're no longer saproxylates, they're no longer detritivores. That food source of the dead wood is no longer accessible to them. They become flying, pollinating insects. So what they need is a strong nectar source. And this is where hawthorn are amongst the very best. So hawthorn are part of the rose family, Rosaceae. Basically the majority of fruiting trees and shrubs native to Britain are from the rose family. Things like currants, so apple, hawthorn, blackthorn, rowan, whitebeam, wild service, plum, pear, apple, all part of the rose family. And what they do is that they produce very, very, very nectar-rich flowers. They go for quite a long flower. Bramble's amazing. Bramble's rose family as well. So basically what happens is you have the invertebrates in the tree. They emerge, they become adults. They've got no food source, so they're no longer able to eat what they were eating. But the companion planting of things like hawthorn, crab apple is a brilliant one as well. We try and do it as close as possible to create that food source for the adult pollinating insects. And yeah, hawthorn's one of the absolute very best. Also, because the wood decays very, very well as well. So these trees are amazing because you have the larval stage in the wood, and then straight away they've got like a perfect buffet up here. And again, that kind of inbuilt genius of trees. The tree needs pollinating insects, and it somehow knows that the insects, the invertebrates inside the tree, tend to hatch and emerge around May, which is exactly when this tree flowers. So the tree's worked out, the pollinating insects is worked out to sort of sync its flowering with the emergence of these invertebrates. So again, it's the inbuilt genius of trees, really. To me, it's just utterly incredible. And also just these, I can't speak highly enough of hawthorn. I absolutely love it. Just the way that the trunk and the bark and the wood inside goes, it's just amazing. If you've got garden space at home and you want to plant the most bang for your buck in terms of ecology and pollinating and everything, I'd go for hawthorn or crabapple. Be my two top recommendations. If you've got more space in your garden or you've got a bit of land, let the bramble grow. It's always my top recommendation. I started off my career bramble bashing, but now I'm just bramble infusing. Okay, so this is a lime tree, not the citrus fruit, but tilia or linden. These are really, really, really amazing to look at as veteran and ancient trees because they decay really, 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 really quickly, but they grow really, 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 really quickly as well. So when I said about how, trees theoretically can be immortal, lime is amongst the best cases because it puts out so much new growth. It can be a bit tricky to manage at times, but it's just amazing. Now, someone was asking about how the hawthorn was still alive because of the decayed area. Some trees, always blows my mind how little sapwood they actually need to keep going. So if you sort of are able to look inside, this tree is completely hollowed out. We might be able to see on others as well, but the actual body, the heartwood of the tree is completely hollowed out, and basically we're having almost several new trees growing in place. And so what we've looked at before, realistically you'll have very, very different, potentially different species growing inside it. Now the key difference with this lime compared to the oaks that we've looked at is this is a much denser canopy, so around here it's a much cooler environment. And also with the oaks you have a lot of dead wood up top, whereas in here most of the decaying wood's on the trunk. All across the tree at different heights you'll have different species growing, and part of that is due to the competition amongst species. So you said about what height should you leave the tree stump at. The most unhelpful answer is as tall as possible. And that's because you have different species growing, like I said, at different heights. When trees or wood hits the ground, a whole bunch of new species are introduced from the soil. The soil is full of bacteria, full of fungi, full of all sorts, whereas the top of the tree isn't. And as much as we try and leave now dead branches and dead trunks on the ground, what we still need to do is keep as much in the canopy as possible, because you can have really, really obscure, rare habitats just on dead horizontal branches, and they're amongst the most uncommon now because of safety management. But has everyone heard of like crust fungi on trees? So these are very, very, well, they're called resupinate, but they're very small, like crusts of discoloration on a branch, and that's a very, very thin fungus. And these are sort of trees that work almost in harmony. They're fungi that work in harmony with the tree. Where they have weakened branches, they'll basically kill off the rest of the branch, and it allows the branch to blow off in the wind or just to die, and new growth can emerge. But where you have, so those species thrive in the canopy of a tree where there's much, much less competition as you'd get from the ground. So things like, there's one called Villaminia comedens and Peniophora coquina. I try and avoid technical terms as much as I can, but I just don't know the common names of those fungi. So those are ones that emerge on aerial deadwood, and then you have different species of invertebrate, particularly like hoverflies and smaller beetles, living up in the top of the canopy. And you see a lot of how dense the populations can be by the amount of woodpecker holes as well. But when the wood comes down on the ground, be it blows out, the tree falls down, or we take the dead wood out of the tree, all of a sudden those species that thrive up in the top of the tree are getting out-competed by all the different fungi that come up from the soil as well. So actually it's not just retaining dead wood on the ground, it's actually keeping as much in the canopy of the tree as well, keeping as much of the tree. And then you'll have species like stag beetles which specialise in the bottom 2 metres and the trunk, but where you might have a lot of stag beetles, it might be out competing other species which are kind of forced a bit higher up the tree. So if you were to cut every dead tree at 1 metre, you're kind of losing out on much more metres worth of different species that can live. And also you tend to have okay, so this isn't the best example to show you, but just imagine we've got an old branch that's broken off and you've got a nice decaying cavity in the trunk. You'll have different species, so you'll have a different type of decay. So the higher up the dead pocket of wood is, you'll have things like water coming in, rain coming in, water retention creates a different type of moisture. And then you'll have different species. Not everyone's favourite, but mosquitoes are still quite an important part of the ecosystem, and they tend to like quite watery pockets. If you want a reason to like mosquitoes, bats. So mosquitoes are great bat food, so there's a reason to like mosquitoes. They're good for bats. But again, if we were just to have 2 metre stumps, we're losing a lot of that other species and habitat where other species like to grow. We have basal decay, probably from a species of Ganoderma known as the southern bracket or the artist conch. It's a much more common basal decayer. So the saying about trees is trees don't heal, they seal. So I said about how if I cut my arm, the skin cells will scab over and regenerate. whereas the dead wood on the tree will always be dead. What the tree does, it produces new wood on top of the dead wood from the cambium, from the regeneration cells. So every growth season it puts on new wood, and where you have cavities and holes, it comes inward as well. So down here, this is actually new wood being produced by the tree to actually seal over that decaying area. So the general purpose of that is to starve the fungi, the decay fungi, of oxygen, so they can't grow anymore. But something like that, as such a big wound, can take 20, 30, 40, 50 years to fully occlude. So by the time that's fully occluded, most of the bottom of the tree will be decayed, which in itself isn't a problem, because from a mechanical perspective, this new wood is stronger than the old wood was. So that's why, if you look at the storm of 87 or the recent storms we had back in February, the trees that blow down tend not to be these older ones. They tend to be the tall, maiden, sort of, from a forestry perspective, ideal trees. But also, can everyone see the spider's webs? So that's a great example of invertebrate succession. So you have the decaying area of the wood, then you have the primary decayers doing all the decaying, and then when they've emerged, you have the other secondary invertebrates come through, which tend to be, rather than the beetles, they tend to be the smaller flies, crane flies, hoverflies and such. And then spiders sort of realise where they are and put their webs out there as well. So again, spiders, they're not tree-dependent species, but they capitalise on that predatory nature of knowing where the other species are coming out of. And then of course, it slightly decays back into the soil, so you have different species that are just working underground as well. And then I haven't talked about worms. Worms will come up from the ground and then pull the decaying material back in as well. I haven't talked about... This took me a while to get my head around, but there's things that are somewhat referred to as tree nesting invertebrates. And nesting invertebrates, I was like, well, that to me doesn't make sense. I was like, okay, hang on, it's actually wasps and bees. So one of the amazing things about especially on lime trees, the cavities cause, it can be really, really great for things like bees and wasps. Either solitary mining bees can sort of burrow in, or actual proper, those amazing hornet and wasp nests that you can find inside trees as well. Quite a few trees I've found just swarming in bees and hornets, wasps. An amazing example of why you should leave stumps. So these are great examples of all can everyone see all the different insect activity that's been on here? So again, great. This is the very, very late stage. All that amazing crumbly goodness. And
sounds like you're a chef, Greg.
And this is just full of probably stag beetles. One thing that I learned that surprised me is, I won't stay too long because it's sunny here. The generalist species of invertebrate, they don't always care about what species the tree is. They actually more care about the type of decay. So the amount of times where we've taken down a London plane and the base of the plane tree is as decayed from invertebrates as that. So quite a few occasions I found stag beetles at the bottom of London plane, and the amount of woodpeckers that I see, woodpecker holes in London plane trees as well. And I can name at least 15 species of fungi I've found on plane trees. Every single one of those fungi is creating decay and hollows in the tree. And the generalist species, they're not so bothered about the species of wood, but the actual habitat being created. So from a species recovery specialist perspective, yeah, they're not great. But for just urban parks, general habitat, they're still surprisingly good. But we'll move over here to...
Greg, how big is a stag beetle when it's a grub? Because I'm looking at some...
surprisingly
so
big.
those are their size.
I think so. I think they're like that size.
They're like a widget. That's the lesser one, do you reckon? See where the grubs have been in here, and the lattice work that they form, and it's incredibly light now because it's just literally, it's like a hollowed out shell. Look at all the holes. I'll pass that around. I'll have a look.
Yeah, once you actually take the water out of wood, it's surprisingly light, and then when it's just the So that's just the basic framework, just the lignified structure that's left.
I'm not sure. It's like balsa wood.
It's exactly like balsa wood feels.
Looking surprisingly good in terms of their leaves. But can everyone see this little mark? So that's a leaf mining moth or wasp, I forget which, but it's a horse chestnut leaf miner. So this isn't a big problem in terms of tree health, but it's more of the visual impact. So these are an introduced species of micro moth. Lay their eggs, the eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae burrow around, eat the inside of the leaf, creates all this brown discoloration, and it hatches off into a moth, repeats the cycle. It's more of a visual thing, not ideal though. But again, it's just another example of kind of the power plant aspect of leaves, that they're nutrients and they're food for everybody really. Well, one thing that's quite good here about being an old deer park is it's not a plant. You do have plantations here, but it's not a plantation woodland. You have open grown trees, and where you have open grown trees, you have big low branches, and where you have big low branches, you tend to have those decay pockets, as opposed to parkland or close grown trees. They just grow upwards. They don't produce that much different habitat. But one thing I did want to talk about as well, luckily by the cafe I found these. So these are tiny little brown spheres which are oak galls, oak iron galls, and these are basically incubators for the trees, not the tree, the gall wasp's offspring. So this is a gall wasp, which is a tiny wasp. Well, it's one of many species, and they fly around, and depending on the species, they either lay their eggs on leaves or flower buds, or they actually inject their wasp stinger into the flower bud. And what it does, it kind of corrupts the DNA of that area. And in this case, this example, this type of gall, it was supposed to be a flower that became an acorn, but the gall wasp has tricked the tree. Rather than to create an acorn, it creates one of these galls, which is basically like an incubator for its offspring. And this is one of the native species. This is part of the ecosystem, which is great. There are a number of invasive species, such as the knopper gull, so they can outcompete the native gulls. There's an amazing one called the artichoke gull, which looks like a Jerusalem artichoke. They're amazing. Haven't seen any here. But one of the things that I love about these is, in my view, they're the most important discovery in Western civilization, in my view. How they discovered this, I don't know, but the medieval monks worked out, if you crush this in a pestle and mortar to a fine powder, add in things like water, honey and sulfuric acid, it actually creates a permanent ink source. And prior to that, everything was either carved into wooden tablets or cave paintings and stuff. So discovering you could create ink out of this iron gall, actually in Western civilization created one of the first sources of permanent ink, which basically catapulted civilization centuries, because it was the first written source. So things like the Magna Carta, the US Declaration of whatever it is, some of the most important historical texts in Western history came from the ink from this, which to me is just totally...
But they form amazing shapes, don't they, Greg, when it genetically modifies them?
Yeah.
You can find the most ornate shapes.
It's incredible. So in the autumn, there's the Cheerio gull, or the cushion gull. So you find it on the underside of oak leaves, and they're these tiny... I call them hemorrhoid cushions, but they look like small brown Cheerios on the underside. I was hoping to see some on the line, but I didn't. You had these tiny, thin, red, what they're called nail gulls, these tiny little red fingers, nails. The artichoke gull is amazing. On willow, you have the crimson gull, or the ruby gull, which is like this amazing sort of red ruby shape. On rose, you have the robin's pincushion, which is really, really stunning. These oak leaves are red. So I mentioned right at the start, I got everyone to feel the oak leaves. They're quite tough and leathery. When leaves first emerge, they're much softer and more flexible. They're also much more vulnerable. So they're full of sugars, full of energy, and the flies want to burrow in and get all the energy and the sugars. Obviously the tree doesn't do that, but it hasn't changed its leaf to become tough and leathery. So again, how they work this out, I don't know, but they worked out that the sap-sucking insects can't really register the colour purple or red. Like pollinating insects can, that's why they say plant things like heather and lavender, purple flowering, but these sapsuckers can't. So where you have leaves like this that emerge red, it's actually tree camouflage.
Wow.
Things like walnut emerge red, purple as well. And also why you can have quite fragrant leaves, because that's insect repellent. Yeah, so here's again amazing example of that brown rot. So this is probably something like chicken of the woods and the beefsteak fungus. So again, you've got all this sort of crumbling brown decay here. You see there's some white flecks on this. So that's old mycelium. Mycelium is the actual body of the fungus. So the actual mushrooms and toadstools that you see, they're like the fruit tree, the fruit on a fruit tree, whereas the actual body of the fungus doing the work, doing the decay, are these sort of white bands and white shoots that work through the tree, sort of secreting and dissolving it. So that's what it actually looks like. Again, lots and lots of tiny holes all over this. We call it cubical brown rot because it just fractures and crumbles into cubes. There's a lot of fun to be had just poking around dead trees, looking at decaying areas really. Cool, so should we head back to...
Just say a thank you to Greg for an excellent talk. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks.